This is Reading Reddit, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode. This one is about people standing up to toxic relatives, and personally, revenge against those people is just. Mwah. So let's get started quickly. It's going to be a bit of a long one. Um, have your headphones in if you want to do a chore or two, but let's strap in now. The first story is from ProRevenge called I Cost My Wife and I to Lose Contact with 90% of her relatives over my decision to stand up against an elderly relative's abuse. Years ago, I married into a family that is both very large and very conservative. It was in another country, and I won't reveal which country for reasons of privacy. In this family, every second or third cousin was as close as a first cousin, and there was an abundance of them. And the family elder members were held in high esteem, almost to the point where they were infallible. There was one man in that family I came to despise. He was the brother of my wife's grandmother, and he lived around the corner of our house. He was a simple man, not particularly well-to-do, although his house was quite pretty. A widower, he had married again to a woman who was herself on her second marriage. He had adult children of his own, stepchildren, and some very young children, a baby and toddler, with his new wife. The man was very pious, teetotaler, member of the Adventist church. He carried with him a guitar to every mass where he'd play psalms and gospel music. Often we would hear music coming from his house. At first, me and this man's family were okay. I heard some bad stories, sure, but I never minded it much. I needed to give him the benefit of the doubt, I felt. So, I did. This man, let's call him Uncle Bing, he had a stepdaughter who lived with his wife and him. They made that girl work the field of the farm nearby. For hours on end, she would have to stand in the field, scaring birds away to protect the crops. They made her into a human scarecrow. This made me uncomfortable, but I hid my feelings. Speaking out wouldn't help anyway, my wife said, because of cultural differences and whatnot. But things just kept getting worse. The more I found out about the man, the more it destroyed me to live near to him and see the things he'd done to that poor girl. She ran away from home on 5 occasions. Each time she was found and severely beaten. I befriended a man and woman from the village who one day found her hiding in the house of the woman's father. She had climbed into the highest tree and fallen asleep there. They found her in the morning. As it turns out, Uncle Bing had been starving his stepdaughter. The younger kids, his biological children by a second wife, got nice food. His stepdaughter, let us call her Cinderella, she got nothing but plain rice or old bread. On warm days, if an ice cream vendor would pass by, bells ringing, Uncle Bing would send out his wife with some money to buy the kids ice cream. Everyone but Cinderella. If she was lucky, she would get the thrown-away ice cream cone of her brother half chewed up. Or nothing at all, as most of the time they'd never even call for her on the field nearby. On scorching hot days, she would pull the little kids around in a plow, a very heavy old metal thing, and her stepfather would sit on his old lazy ass on the same plough as they used her as a human donkey for their amusement. Whenever Cinderella's little brother had a birthday, Uncle Bing would slaughter a pig. Members of the church would drop by the house and sing songs. Big party. Cinderella's birthday came and went, unnoticed. One year, on her birthday, my wife and I gave her an umbrella as a gift, so that at least she would be dry on her daily 3-mile walk to school. Thus, forced to acknowledge her daughter's birthday, Cinderella's mother, who was as nasty a character as Uncle Bing, decided to give her the rare treat of pancakes, which she would have to bake herself. She baked them. But as she did so, at the same time they made her watch her infant sister and little brother. Naturally, the pancakes got burned. Her mother whipped her with a broom handle until the girl's cries could be heard throughout the neighborhood. This is the point where I had enough. My in-laws tried to stop me from going to the house and speaking up against the family elder, but I had reached my limit. I knocked on the door. Out came Uncle Bing, dragging his wiry body along with a wooden cane tipped with a silver lion's head. I demanded that they treat their daughter better, that it was shameful and unchristian-like the way he treated her, that his facade wasn't fooling anyone, and that if his actions didn't stop there and then, I would expose him to the village and make him lose face, which was essentially the worst thing anyone could suffer out there, to have one's reputation ruined. And he held on to his for dear life. Uncle Bing told me in his broken English that he understood and would act better. I thought this was the end of the story. I hoped it would be. For a few weeks he was on his best behavior. So was Cinderella's mother. The girl went to school regularly again. Sometimes she'd hop and whistle a tune, and she would hardly ever go to the farm anymore. So far, so good. But one day when I was away to another part of the country on business, my wife called me and told me something bad had happened. Her great-uncle had threatened Cinderella very badly after an argument. There had been a lot of screaming and shouting, and the old man had waved a machete at the girl. She had tried to fend him off, and he had sliced her hand with the machete. This was the final straw for me. I couldn't go to the police, and they didn't care about child abuse as much in these parts, and were highly corrupt. Child rights laws hardly existed. So, I wrote down a long essay on the man's behavior, never naming him directly, but describing him in such a way that everyone would know exactly who the man and his wife that I described were. I wrote it and had my wife translate it in her language, and I then posted it to Facebook. Now, in spite of the country's poverty, even in this tiny village, everyone had somehow had social media. Uncle Bing's cousins, his siblings and their families, his children from his first marriage and their own families. Everyone had Facebook, and I was friends with them all. So I posted it, and the whole village pretty much saw and liked the post. People replied to it, writing in the comments how they saw other bad things being done by the man. Turns out, he was very hated. I always assumed that he was one of those salt of the earth, pillar of the community type of guy, but man, was he hated. And it all came out. All the nasty stories. People even wrote me private messages. One woman, a distant relative, even told me how he violated her when she was a young college student living in Uncle Bing's house. He had been 30 at the time. She had been 19. When I returned to our home, Uncle Bing had already read the letter. I think it was his son or second wife who read it to him. He was so angry, he flew into an all-consuming rage. He broke his guitar, the one he used to play gospel songs on, into 1,000 pieces. He threw rocks at our house, too. My father-in-law filed a police report. They settled things. Everyone in the neighborhood witnessed the old man's meltdown. His wife very much joined in, screeching like a banshee. They made a complete fool out of themselves, and afterwards they hid in their house for days. A year has passed. My wife and I moved far away. We now live in another country. Over 30 of my wife's relatives broke off all contact with her and with me over what we did. Our step against the family elder caused us to be expelled from the family. Exposing his bad side was something they could never forgive. Uncle Bing lost his standing in the village. The members of his church never visit his house anymore. People shun him and his wife, and he has no friends left outside of the family. Within our family, there's a clear line drawn. There are those that hate us for exposing the old man and his ways and who declare that since Cinderella is not a blood relative, only a stepchild, you should have ignored the abuse. And then there are those who personally suffered in silence from this old man's misbehavior for years, who now have the courage to speak out. They applaud us. At times, my wife blames me for the fact that some of her cousins won't talk to her anymore. That's some of her childhood friends, who were her relatives as well, have broken off all contact. My wife's grandmother, Uncle Bing, was sad at first, but she later told us, smiling, "I used to be mad at losing so many relatives over this, but it's for the better. Never mind him and his children and grandchildren anymore. I'm free." 80 years old, and finally, she's free. Her brother, it turns out, had abused his siblings for decades. He had threatened my wife's grandmother in a horrible way, involving a machete also. Chased her around the house like a chicken for slaughter. She covered it up out of love for family. Hid it for years, but now she could speak up. Cinderella was never beaten anymore. She goes to school now. For the first time in her life, she has friends. Villagers watch her parents' every move. Uncle Bing and his wife are afraid to even scold her, and they never dare to raise a finger to her again. Thank God. That's all I wanted to achieve. It was worth facing the family's wrath over. At times, I feel a bit weird. The strong position I took meant my wife lost some of her close relatives for good. She could never message them anymore, never call or visit. They blocked her from all social media. She is dead to them for standing up to him and standing by me through this whole ordeal. There have been times when even my wife told me she sometimes regrets how we played things, because she lost some people dear to her, saving a girl she hardly knew. In the end, she stands by what we did and feels that we did the right thing. So TLDR, I exposed the abuse of a girl in my wife's family. By exposing the man who did it, I saved a girl. But it cost my wife her cousins, many of her uncles and aunts, and her childhood friends. So now I'm going to get to, I think there are 2 comments where OP replies, and I'm going to read them now. You did the right thing, and I wager that part of the problem of the relatives is that they are ashamed that they did not have the courage to do what you did. If they knew and said nothing, then they're complicit in the situation. You are better off without them. OP says the relatives were fully aware of what he did. The sister of the man's wife even complained to my wife's grandmother on many occasions about how they abused her niece and how she detested it. But none of them were willing to do anything about it and risk damaging the family's reputation and social standing. So all of the criticism was done as quiet gossip behind closed doors. When we spoke out in public, those family members who previously disapproved of the man's behavior changed their stories. Now Uncle is a sad, old, misunderstood man, and his wife our dear, sweet sister. They pity him and hate us. Because the entire clan looks bad now, it's all out in the open, and it inevitably reflects badly on them. But now that the floodgates have opened, a lot of nasty stuff is coming out all of a sudden. I've heard that they've been fighting, the couple. The old man's wife even left him for 3 days after neighbors overheard them loudly arguing on the farm. But she came back. They're no longer respected in the village, and their act of pious, upstanding citizens have been thoroughly destroyed. And then the pious, upstanding citizens. Hypocrisy detests exposure, doesn't it? And then last one. It does. It all came out after, like poison being sucked out of a wound. Turns out the guy was a raging alcoholic in his youth, expelled from a previous church where he belonged for taking up with a married woman, crashed the van of a relative when drunk, which happened to be the relative's only source of income, habitually threw rocks at people he disliked, chasing them with a machete, stalked his daughter's teacher to her classroom and broke every desk and every chair in it as well as her windows, forced his first wife, when she was dying of a brain tumor, to accuse a person he hated of assaulting her. Around 20 years ago, he rebranded himself, so to speak, got sober, changed churches, reinvented himself, and rewrote his story. One of his children and his sister became financially successful, and it elevated his social standing. He married again, took in his wife's 2-year-old daughter, the one in the story. All things were good. And then I came along, someone unbothered by knowledge or consideration of the culture he came from, and I just torched that carefully built up and polished image and burned it to the ground. It broke him. Ooh, man, this one, that is perfect. That's perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Reading Reddit. Thank you so much. I'll tune in next week. See you soon.